It's finally time for a fresh start in Jacksonville. After 3 seasons, Doug Pederson has been fired. It started off pretty well for him with the Jaguars, but the good times didn't last. The Jags really did just hit rock bottom with a 4-13 season. The roster isn't good enough, the coaching isn't good enough, and Trevor Lawrence hasn't been good enough. And now it's back to square one. And more than anything, Jacksonville just needs to hope that it has their franchise quarterback. The Pederson era was certainly interesting, but ultimately, it had to end. When Doug Pederson was hired by the Jags, it really did feel like a home run hire. Pederson had already had previous success winning a Super Bowl as the head coach of the Eagles, where he helped develop Carson Wentz, and previously was the offensive coordinator of the Chiefs under Andy Reid. He felt safe, and it's exactly what the Jaguars probably needed. It was just such a bad rookie year for Trevor Lawrence, and a lot of it falls on Urban Meyer. He was a complete disaster, and there was a lot of wonder for just how much damage he did to the development of Trevor Lawrence. There needed to be a real adult in the room, and that's exactly what Pederson was. And he did immediately get the most out of Lawrence. The Jaguars weren't incredible, but they did go on a late season run to win the AFC South, finishing 9-8. It was a pretty impressive turnaround year one, and the Jags weren't done yet. Jacksonville had to face off against the Chargers in the wild card round, and it ended up being an instant classic. The Chargers absolutely dominated early, jumping out to a 27-0 lead. And when a team is up 27, the game is essentially over, right? Well, no. Because the Jaguars put together one of the greatest comebacks in NFL history to win 31-30. It was just wild, and it really did help change the narrative around the Jaguars and Trevor Lawrence. Jacksonville did lose the following week to the Chiefs, but it didn't come without a fight. The Jaguars lost by one score, 27-20, and were eliminated. There were then some higher expectations for both the Jaguars and Trevor Lawrence going into the next season, as there should have been. But Jacksonville did much of the same, going 9-8 again, but missed the postseason as the Texans won the division crown. There just had to be some improvements from back-to-back 9-8 seasons, but it only got worse. Way worse, actually. The Jaguars got off to a horrendous start at 0-4. They lost to Miami to start the season, followed by a loss to the Deshaun Watson-led Browns. And losing to Cleveland with Watson really does feel like rock bottom. The Jags then got blown out by the Bills 47-10 and lost to the rival Texans. But then out of nowhere, the Jaguars sort of got hot. I mean, not really, but the Jags did win 2 of 3. Jacksonville beat the Colts in a tight 37-34 win and then lost to the Bears before beating the Patriots. It was a 2-5 start. Not good, but it could have been way worse. Probably. But it did get much worse fast, with 5 losses and a bye along the way to ride into week 14 at 3-10. It really was a tough stretch for Jacksonville. Over the stretch, the Jags lost to the Packers, Eagles, Vikings, Lions, and Texans, all playoff teams. The Jaguars finally finished the season at 4-13, with more losses to the Texans, Jets, Raiders, and Colts in overtime. But don't worry, Jacksonville did successfully ruin its draft stock with 2 wins against the Titans. A 4-13 season. Good for the number 5 pick of the draft. Luckily for the Jags, they don't need a quarterback. I mean, they at least have to stick with Trevor Lawrence for a while, but it isn't great. Doug Pederson, simply put, just didn't accomplish enough in Jacksonville. There was a need for a fresh start again, but at some point, it'll be Trevor Lawrence who gets the finger pointed at. He was supposed to save Jacksonville, and with just how bad Urban Meyer was, it was never going to be an easy task. But the reality is, Lawrence has never really had amazing talent around him. The Jaguars haven't necessarily done a great job building the roster. Doug Pederson is the scapegoat for now, and honestly, it's a miracle that Trent Baalke is still the general manager, but even Baalke just has one more season on a 5-year contract. Shad Khan, for some reason, continues to keep him around even after the disaster of Urban Meyer and now the firing of Doug Pederson. It hasn't been pretty, and the Jags have been bad for a while now, and it doesn't seem like Jacksonville is getting out of that hole anytime soon now. I know it's hard to remember, but the Jaguars did play in an AFC championship not too long ago. Jacksonville won the AFC South and beat both the Bills and Steelers to get one game away from the Super Bowl, but lost to the Patriots in the AFC Championship. That was full season 1 for Doug Marrone. He was the interim in 2016 after Gus Bradley was fired and ended up getting the job. His tenure started off well with a lot of promise, even despite having Blake Bortles as his starter, but it just didn't last. Jacksonville went 5-11 the season after making the AFC Championship and then went 6-10 in 2019. The Jags just weren't good enough, and the worst was still to come. 2020 was a complete mess for the Jaguars. They were supposed to be terrible, but then Gardner Minshew got a big Week 1 win against the Colts, so maybe the Jags were better than expected.
Do not be satisfied with 1-0.
Yeah, no, they weren't. Jacksonville went on to lose the next 15 straight to get the number 1 overall pick and use it on Trevor Lawrence. He was supposed to be the savior, but he hasn't been, and maybe it's because of his rookie year that was just such an absolute train wreck with Urban Meyer. He started off 2-11 and was a media headache pretty much the entire time. So Meyer ended up getting fired after only 13 games as the head coach. Luckily, he did do enough damage for the Jags to be the worst team in the league and get the number 1 pick again, but the Jags made a pretty interesting choice on draft day. They took Trayvon Walker first overall, and it was a pretty criticized pick with Aiden Hutchinson still on the board, who ended up going number 2 overall to the Lions. Walker had to develop a bit more, and he 100% has. He has back-to-back seasons with double-digit sacks, and he is good. Maybe Hutchinson still was the right pick, but Jacksonville didn't necessarily miss on the pick. And it's pretty similar with Lawrence too. The Jags didn't miss, but he hasn't exactly lived up to what he was drafted to be. Trevor Lawrence was supposed to be the savior for the Jaguars, but it didn't materialize the way some scouts expected. He was seriously considered a generational prospect. Lawrence was being named in the same breath as Peyton Manning and Andrew Luck. He was supposed to be that good, but wasn't. A lot of that probably does go back to how bad Urban Meyer was for one season. Doug Pederson was much better, and it's clear just how much Lawrence did improve from year 1 to 2, but it wasn't easy to succeed in 2021. The Jags sucked, and Lawrence struggled. He only had 12 passing touchdowns and led the league with 17 interceptions. But it wasn't too much to worry about. Rookie slumps are normal, and he did get better fast. Lawrence turned around to go 9-8 and had 25 touchdowns and 8 interceptions in 2022. Not to mention the playoff game Jacksonville had, which just did a ton for the narrative around Lawrence and the Jags. There was an expectation for him to continue to develop and get better, and the same goes for the Jaguars. And the biggest problem in why Doug Pederson did get fired is that it hasn't gotten much better. The Jaguars went 9-8 again, and Lawrence went 8-8. He regressed to throw 21 touchdowns and 14 interceptions, and Jacksonville needed to bounce back, and they essentially did the complete opposite this past season. The Jags were awful. They went 4-13, and Lawrence was 2-8 in his starts. He missed a lot of time with an AC joint sprain. He did return, but got hit on a very controversial one from Azeez Al-Shaair, so Lawrence did ultimately land on injured reserve. It was a bad season from Lawrence, and the Jags need him to be good. He's about to play on his 5th-year option and has already got signed to a 4-year, $275 million extension, which, by the way, has $142 million guaranteed. Jacksonville just needs him to work out, or it's just going to be a mess. The Jaguars desperately have to make the right call at head coach now, but it's honestly a wonder of who will actually want the job. An offensive guy would be great for Lawrence, but can Jacksonville actually get a good offensive coordinator like a Ben Johnson, Liam Cohen, or Todd Monken? A defensive coordinator would be fine. Robert Saleh and Brian Flores could get another run, or try out an Aaron Glenn or even Steve Spagnuolo if he ever leaves the Chiefs. It really has been rocky for Jacksonville, but Shad Khan now has to hit, and if he doesn't, Trent Baalke is gone, and it might be time to have a serious conversation about Trevor Lawrence. It feels like it's been so long now since the AFC Championship appearance, and that's because it has been. It was the peak for the Jags, and now, even with an expected franchise quarterback, the Jags are right back in the basement of the NFL and had to fire a Super Bowl winning head coach, Doug Pederson.